You're listening to Culture 360, the podcast that takes you inside the world of workplace and team culture. I'm Stu Savage, your host and guide, as we explore the ideas, people, and stories shaping the way we work, lead, and connect. So please subscribe, sit back, relax, and enjoy culture from every angle. Hello, good people, and welcome to the Culture 360 podcast, Culture from Every Angle. I'm your host and guide, Stu Savage. And today, it's episode 1 of our 3-part series based around education. The school wasn't built for me, when the rules, routines, and language of an organisation fit some people and not others. Exploring one of the most important and often overlooked questions in education. What does it really mean to belong? Well, we're delighted to welcome back a familiar voice to Culture 360, joining us once again, Duncan Morrison, Assistant Head Teacher at Bridgwater School in Warrington. Many of our listeners will remember Duncan from episode 5, where we explored the culture and climate within school education and discussed how environments we create shape both learning and human potential. We're also thrilled to welcome a new guest to the podcast, Jamie Gillespie, Assistant Head Teacher, St Thomas More Catholic High School in Crewe. He's an extensive leadership and teaching experience with him. He's also here to keep Duncan in line and keep Duncan on his toes.
No
Gentlemen,
chance.
welcome. It's the depths of winter here in New Zealand, and I keep hearing about these heat waves across Europe. And I think that means one thing: the academic year is nearly at an end. Is that right?
Very close, getting there.
Yeah, so effectively, Stu, what that means is you've got 32 children in a red hot room with a sweating teacher and everybody looking very tired with no AC.
So the end is in sight. You'll all be booking your summer holidays, right?
Yeah, I think it's already done.
Another trip to Rill.
There's nothing wrong with North Wales. Anglesey. One of the most salient points to come across the podcast, certainly the last podcast Duncan and I did, was the need for belonging in education. And that comes through all of the work that we've done with Culture 360 in the Culture Room. And it just permeates, the thread comes through about belonging. So the opening question for you two is, what are the main issues around belonging in schools at present? What are you grappling with? And how are you evolving those solutions? Open floor question for you both.
Do you want me to start, Jay?
Yeah, go on then.
I mean, Stu, I think if we go back a step there and talk about what, the title of today's episode is, which is the idea of the school not being built for students. I think when people say that about any organisation, and it's true not just of schools, they're not talking about the building, right? They're not saying that the building wasn't built for them in particular. And even in schools, they're not necessarily talking about the curriculum. I think what they're talking about, and this is something I know you've said a lot on your previous podcast with the myriad of guests you've had over the last couple of years, it's that feeling they get. So it's that feeling that when they walk into the building or experience the curriculum, I think what we're talking about is that certain children from certain groups maybe feel not anything other than a feeling that they feel like an outsider. And I think that would be a real good starting point. You know what Jay thinks about that?
Well, the thing is with that is that when you look at it, it's first impressions, isn't it? So what you're saying there is when you first go into, as an adult, when you first go into a place of work or you go and experience something for the first time, you only get one chance at a first impression. So when a pupil or a student comes into a school, they get a feeling for that. They get a feeling for the way they're interacted with, and this sense of belonging. You can put a badge on things and you can show them the school blazer and things like that, but it's the lived experience, and it's the lived experience before they even cross that threshold. So it's that idea, isn't it, of, you've talked previously about building cultures and this understanding of what it means to have a strong culture in a school. It's all good and well having a culture if people don't believe in that culture or it's not lived by them.
Yeah, Jay, I'll jump in there and say that I think what it ultimately means, I'm borrowing from, not me, this is not my idea, Stu, so please, this is from the academic researcher Brown, who talks about this idea of true belonging is when you can be who you are, you don't have to change to fit in. Because for some students, and I'm not just talking about students from disadvantaged backgrounds here, I'm talking from students with, acknowledged neurodiversity, for example. It's exhausting. It's exhausting fitting in. And sometimes the older kids they hit the teenage years and they stop trying. It's too hard. It's too hard to fit in.
But the thing is with that though, Dunk, is that you've got those neurodiverse pupils, students who are masking, and they're masking. And what you just said there before is exactly right. It's bang on, where it's that you are yourself. We talk about uniqueness within our students and our pupils, and this idea of you can be whatever you want to be. But sometimes society doesn't look that way as well. Sometimes it places them in a box, and it places them in something like a send box, or it places them in whatever box it is. And then we expect them to belong. We expect them to thrive. We expect them to achieve, in Ofsted speak.
I was going to say that's taken from the toolkit there, Jay.
Yeah, exactly. But that's the thing, though, isn't it? That's the absolute. They're the three main areas where we're judged on by saying, do you know what, right? If all your students are belonging, and they're all in school and they're all achieving and they're thriving and personal development's going through the roof, wow, you're an amazing place. But how many of us are working in a place like that?
So I mean, to sum it up, right, I'll work backwards here to answer your question, right? Belonging for children in schools, whether it be primary, secondary, or even tertiary, it's this idea that they spend their energy working on the curriculum, not working out how to fit in or how to behave, as Jay just said, right? So that would be the answer to that question for me. I don't know whether Jay would agree with that. So a pupil needs to spend their energy thriving, not surviving, to calling Jamie and Ofsted there. I think how we do that is, it's not necessarily, we spend a lot of time teaching children how to ask questions, how to, challenge politely, and how to talk to adults, and, how to get the feedback from the teachers. But there is certain children in school that can't even get to that because they spend lots of their energies subconsciously trying to be part of the game, trying to know the rules for the game. And then before we even get to those things, which, as Jay knows, how many times, Jay, have you walked into detention and seen the same 6 kids for being rude to staff? And literally, it's not necessarily a behavioural issue. They're not rude children. They just haven't really understood how to, I've done it myself. Take your hands out your pockets when I'm talking to you. Look at me when I'm talking to you. For some children, that's not the first thing that my kids know how to behave when they're getting told off, because they know how to say sorry and move it on.
It's that thing as well, though, Dunk, isn't it? Where it's as I alluded to at the beginning, it's that first interactions, and I don't mean first impressions. Now, I'm talking about as they come into your place of work, as they come into your school, and it's that thing of, are you ready to learn? And ready to learn to your children, or to my children, or to Stu's children might look very, very different. Being ready to learn and having that first interaction is, have they got a tie on? Why haven't they got a tie on? Have they been fed last night? So for them coming into a school, and then you're just saying there, thriving for some of those pupils are being in that day and not being put in the chokey for half an hour, or not being suspended, and they've done a bit of work. But how are we rewarding that? What are we doing with those pupils to say, that is real life, that's the way life is? Because sometimes we are their champion. Sometimes we're the ones who will make sure they're okay, and we'll safeguard them, and we'll do the PD stuff with them. But it's, as you just said there, we expect people to behave. Behaviour is taught. It's a taught curriculum. So we can't just assume for all our pupils that, do you know what, right, belonging is that we're all doing the same thing. We're all singing hymns in assemblies. It just doesn't work.
That's such a good way to put it. If belonging's not something you can just assume, what's the micro moment that tells you that a kid belongs or doesn't? Like, paint me a picture. What does that look like on a busy Year 9 corridor?
So, I mean, for me, when you talk about a busy corridor in a high school, and over the years, me and Jay have been in many, I suppose what belonging looks like on that corridor is a Year 9. You said Year 9, didn't you? Pupil speaking naturally to staff, being listened to and having a conversation, rather than a performative conversation whereby they feel they're fitting in, more of a reciprocal conversation where it's, it's based out on respect for each other and an understanding for each other. So that's what it would look like, Stu.
Do you know what? Duncan? That's the absolute correct way of looking at it. And it's that thing, from my point of view, it's the unseen moments. It's the moments which win everything else. It's that thing, isn't it, of catching and being good. Catching and being good is when you're walking down a corridor and a year 9 pupil and no one's looking, no one's there. It's you and it's them. And they hold the door open for you and you walk past and you say, thank you very much for that. How's your day? And it's not this scripted conversation. It's not this Catholic social teaching. It's not these core values of the culture of the school. It's that natural moment of, you're all right. And it's a big thing for us, Stu, is this idea of knowing our pupils. And I know it's different in schools, which are absolutely massive, like Duncan's is. I work in a very small high school, but it's knowing your pupils. And it's having that conversation walking down the corridor of, you playing footy this weekend? No, game's cancelled, said it's too hot. Well, in my day, I would have played and I would have had a drink of water and not a rehydration break after 21 minutes. But it's that natural conversation.
And scored a hat-trick, Jay.
Well, a perfect hat-trick, left foot, right foot, and then one off my backside.
Probably a penalty for you, you little sneak.
Well,
diving.
Anyway, let's get back to...
Yeah, I'd add to that. Yeah, you're right. It is intentional though, so that it isn't scripted, but it has to be intentional. Jay, you'd agree with that, wouldn't you?
100%. That students know if you're being respectful, and also if you're being sincere, if you're being honest with them.
Yeah, so just what Jay was talking then about, he referenced size of schools. Let's be 100% certain here. Ofsted don't care whether your school is like Jamie's, 600-700 kids, Catholic, one site, or 1,700 kids, split site like ours is. They don't care. You're going to need to walk around with the senior leader as an inspector, and they're going to expect you to know the children in the room. The feedback I've had from colleagues who've been through inspection, it's not this, oh, we're dead big. It's who's that? What can you tell me about them? What am I going to see here? What's their book going to look like? And so implicitly in the toolkit, it's the golden thread of inclusion, as we refer. Jamie's heard that before. He's probably being sick. That golden thread of inclusion, and that means knowing children, because you can't include if you don't know them, Stu.
So you've mentioned there about knowing every student and having a relationship with them, and I guess a point of contact and building that relationship. But in a school of so many, is that possible? And forming relationships with all those key points of contact?
I mean, look, don't forget, Stu, within any school ecosystem, there's different people at different levels. So, the likes of myself in my role, and I know that me and Jamie do a similar role across our schools, that undeniably, there's children I know better because their intensity or the complexity of which they present in school. Other children who maybe not necessarily are on any sort of child protection register, or, who are at risk of PMX, are the kind of children myself and Jamie deal with. There's children at different layers. Like my children, for example, didn't really cause any trouble at school, but someone knows them. Their teachers know them, the form tutors know them, the heads of year know them. So, I know my classes, Jamie knows his classes. And that's, again, it's that intentional knowing your class and trying to ensure you make that connection.
I think you touched on this back in episode 5 too, like that constant churn, gaining 300 kids and then losing 300 kids every single year through the school. So the culture's then in constant flux. Is that something that you actually consciously work on? Or is it something that you're rebuilding on repeat and isn't really a focus?
Yeah, 100%. And it comes down to, when you say in there, when you're losing your 300 and you're gaining your 300, I suppose it's that transition work as well, isn't it? To get out there, and our staff are really, really good. And I know I keep on alluding to the fact that we're a small school, but it's that idea of being preemptive, to know your pupils as they come in, and they will obviously evolve. They will obviously change over time. And I think when we're talking about that inclusion as a school, it's the idea that we follow them through that path, we follow them through that journey to be able to say, do you know what, right? As our year 11s have just left, and as a leaving gift, we give them their mission journal from year 7, which they have all the targets and all the hopes and dreams for the next 5 years. And they look at them and there's a picture of them when they're in year 7. And it's one of the nicest things to do. And we have our leavers mass after that, because they're there and they feel like they're part of it and they feel like they belong. And that's the whole point. That's what we're talking about today. The idea of, do you know what, right? Somebody's been there looking out for me all across those 5 years with my ups and my downs as well. And it's the ability as a teacher, as a professional, to be able to then go, do you know what, right? Do you remember that time? Do you remember you were on the ski trip and you nearly fell off the mountain? Oh, that was amazing. My mum went mad at you. And you're like, yeah, well, I saved you. Anyway, let's move on. Thanks for the gift. So it's that kind of thing, isn't it?
Before we go any further, you two used a word before we started recording that I wanted to highlight. You used the word habitus. And for anyone who's never heard the term, can you break it down into plain English or layman's terms? What is it and how does it actually show up in the classroom?
Habitus. I'll tell you the best way of describing habitus, Stu, for someone who doesn't know. I nearly was disrespectful last year. So it's the idea, when you turn your computer on and there's an operating system. Any organisation, whether it be the NHS, whether it be the town hall, whether it be schools, whether it be corporates, they have an operating system. Yeah. So they're the rules that organisation operates in. Now, the rules, therefore, are installed without people realising them, and they're normally installed by people who know the operating system. So when a kid comes to school, when we talk about habitus, Bordeaux talks about mismatch. It's a big part of sort of when people walk through your door. They're not familiar with the rules. They can read the rules and observe the rules, but the rules are not familiar to them. So the vast majority of students who come to a school are familiar with things like authority, education. They understand the importance of education, the long-term game. We talk about confidence and language and having dreams and aspiration. Now, that's the vast majority of students. But maybe, depending on your setting, there's a good percentage of children that will find that challenging to even understand the rules of the game, to understand the mismatch. And schools reward children on, I would say 5 things. Jay can jump in here and say, so how good they are at English. Obviously, that's a key to unlocking the curriculum. We look for those who can confidently speak, answer questions, tell me why you're out of lessons. Good with books, good with castles, great with geography, no words over is. They have expected and experienced rugby, football, cricket, golf, and then when we put that on as a reward at the end of term, everyone loves it, or do they? And then ultimately the big thing is knowing how schools work. So lots of students who would be classed as maybe middle-class students know how to play the game. They understand what the man wants. They give the man what he wants, even if he doesn't, because they know that creates less of traction and friction along the way. Where this becomes important for students and their families, think how many times, Dave, you had some mad conversation with the parents and you just can't even get through to them. What you're trying to say is because there's a mix match, there's a habitus problem, as Bordeaux would call it.
It's 100% correct, and it's what I talked about before, that lived experience. And when you're saying there about how we reward in the middle class pupil knowing how to play the game, the systems game almost. What we're finding now, though, is we're getting more and more pupils or students coming into us now who have got an inability to play the game, and the inability to play the game comes from that lack of aspiration, that lack of inspiration from the home setting. And when it comes from the home setting, there's a gap in learning straight away. And there's a gap in that understanding of what I need to do in order to get from the beginning of year 7 to the end of year 13, and which is the best way for me. So we're coming in now and we're having really, really low reading ages now, which means that those students can't access the curriculum fully.
I'll give you an example there, Stu. So, right, I tell you what is not exclusive is Macbeth, right? That is not a problem. So this is not about saying, why are we teaching, Shakespeare? Anybody who's got any common sense in teaching knows why we teach Shakespeare, right? They're cracking stories. and you need to think, right? End of. Macbeth also has a King Duncan in it, which is something that is sweet to my ears. But, there's no problem with teaching Macbeth. Where the mismatch comes is the teacher. I remember my Macbeth story. I've told Jamie this before. I remember in Savio High School in Poole in the 80s, Mr. Dunn, my favourite teacher, he read the opening gambit from Macbeth, the bit with the witches. And this lad, who was in year 10 at the time, I won't name, was also the captain of the local darts team, pub team, the Jawbone Tavern. Jay, you've been there for a pint. In year 10, I remember he just said in his loudest Scouse accent, "You what?" And I just remember the colour draining from Mr. Dunn's face as he realised he had 2 years of trying to explain Macbeth to 30 lads from Bootle in the 80s. But it isn't the problem. Macbeth's not the problem. Do you know what the problem is, Stu? Is when those children arrive in that classroom, they don't understand what tragedy is.
Yeah.
They don't understand what treachery and revenge are. So the way to get around that is you pre-teach those words. Now, lots of good teachers do that anyway. There isn't a smoking gun here, by the way. Lots of good teachers do that. But there's nothing wrong with teaching Macbeth. I would argue, and I don't know whether Jay would agree or even yourself, Stu, it's how you pre-teach it. Because the value in teaching Macbeth is huge. But it's the access to get the rules of the game of Macbeth. You've got to understand certain key concepts first. Then you'll enjoy it. Discuss.
With that one is that when we're saying whose responsibility is it? It's the way that pre-teaching's done, isn't it? Sometimes you'll be able to talk about tragedy and you'll be able to talk about that. As an Evertonian, I live in tragedy most seasons. And it's that conversation on the yard. It's that conversation where you're following lesson when you're talking about tragedy. That same pupil that you've seen on the yard and you've lent them a football because they've kicked it over the garden again because they're not really that good. They turn around and say, you suffered tragedy because of it. Let's discuss that one then. Then you get the buy-in then you get people then who are going, they understand tragedy through football. And I suppose sometimes we talk about with Mr. Dunn's just Duncan's favourite teacher there. Mine was Mr. Hind. He taught me law. And it's you buy into that teacher then, don't you? You believe in what they're saying. You believe in what they're doing. And I think it's when you're saying, Stu, whose responsibility is, I think it's everyone's.
And I'd agree with that, mate. And you know what? Back in the day, I remember when I first started teaching 20 odd years ago, you would find smoking guns in the curriculum. So you would open the SATs paper for year sixes and it would be, you're at the local village fete. Describe, and I'm thinking, if someone had asked me that in Bootle about a village fete, I wouldn't know what you were talking about. But if they had said, you're in the local legion, you're by the fruit machine, somebody's giving you a Diet Coke and a packet of crisps, why, they're grand. This sounds like our childhood, Jay.
I know, exactly.
Do you know what I mean? Then I'd be able to access that. So it's not about latent ability, and it's not even a smoking gun anymore. You won't find that. You won't open up you won't go into a scheme of work in year 9 and find some middle class, Midsummer Murders type setting. You're not going to get it. Where you're going to find a potentially, not a smoking gun, but a slightly warm one, is the quality of teaching and how people pre-teach. Because there's nothing about IQ, right, that's got anything to do with how many castles you were taken to. That's ability, that's you're born with it. I know my mum spent our whole childhood dragging us to museums and libraries and that, and I know Jamie's family were the same, and we've done that for our kids. So whose responsibility is? Well, it's the family, innit? But if that doesn't happen, then we've got to make sure in school that we make sure everybody's on the same level. Smoking gun, we've spoken, haven't we, at the heart of quality first teaching, at the heart of school leadership, at the heart of youth work and social work, all these different professions that work with the family. It is the importance of relationships. And we've spoken before, haven't we, Stu, about those awkward situations where you're expected to have a relationship instantly, like when you sit on a plane next to someone. And it's a bit like you're sharing elbow spacing for the first 20 minutes until by the end of the flight to Ibiza and you're made up because you're not sat with your family. And there's another dad next to you, and by the end of it, you've had a good chinwag about footy, rugby, whatever. But at the start, it's awkward, isn't it?
It is. That thing about relationships is 100% correct, and it's. I know you spoke about it previously about money in the bank and things like that, and it's this thing, isn't it, of when you've got that relationship with the family, it's not just the pupil or the students, it's the family, and when you've got to have those challenging conversations, the more likely to be able to get down and get to a level where it's, do you know what, right, this is why we're doing something, this is why we're doing it, and I'm dealing with it at the minute, and it's because of the building up of that relationship that you've got people on side to be able to say, do you know what, right, as we talked about previously today, this idea that, do you know what, right, when you take responsibility for things that you do, and it's that thing of, right, this has happened, so this is going to happen next because, and it's that teaching behaviours, it's going through, it's the consistency, it's the power of routines. There's a lot of work with that to be able to set, because we've got a lot of people, you talk about neurodiverse students, some of them struggle with a change, an immediate change. So that's what you've got to be wary of, knowing your pupils, being able to say, this is what's happening because.
What I would say there, Jay, Stu, is I suppose the tagline for this section that we've just been talking about would be something is if teachers and adults know what they're assuming. So when you talk about Macbeth, what are they assuming that these children know? And then just ensure that what you've assumed everybody knows, that would be good teaching for me. So instead of assuming tragedy or ambition or monarchy even, look at that from a history perspective, King Duncan. Long live King Duncan. Although we know he didn't. Unlucky.
Silver linings.
I know, mate. It was good while it lasted. What I would suggest is this idea of the assumption that we make, and that's something that we do. That is the problem in schools, we assume that it's if you're from, there's at least 3 Irish families on there somewhere, big Irish families from the 80s. In my house, in my nan's house in the 80s, at any given night after school, there'd be like 16 cousins. You had to be loud to be heard. You then transpose that into school. Those children are not naughty, they're just loud because they don't get heard otherwise. And then it's
fighting for airspace, aren't they?
Puts them on detention for being loud. They're like, hang on, that's how I survive in my setting. And that's an example of that mismatch, Stu. It's not a behaviour. It's not out of badness. It's just something that we've assumed that everyone knows that the best way in a middle class setting is to sit quietly and wait your turn. But you know what? That isn't always everyone's lived experience. And
exactly, and that's their daily diet at home, isn't it?
That's not
their daily diet at home is not sitting around a dining table at a prescribed time each evening to have a 3-course meal.
I mean, I would argue that even though what we can't do is not recognise that society expects you to behave in that way, and you've got to thrive in school is one thing, but to thrive in society, knowing the rules of society, implicit or otherwise, you need to be able to, like, for example, litter. Lunchtime yesterday, the amount of times I walk around the canteen and say, put that in the bin, put that in the bin. Occasionally, sometimes they look at you and think, isn't that woman's job who walks around with the trolley? And you're like, no, it's not. And then you have to unpack that. But what you don't do is, I tell you what you don't do in that, you don't just rip their heads off for being rude. I mean, that's what would have happened years ago. We would have been, what do you mean? It's that woman's job. How dare you? What you do is, and the kids look at you sometimes when you do that and they're like, she's the cleaner, so is the caretaker. Their job is to clean. Why wouldn't they clean? And what you're trying to explain to them is you're making their job 10 times harder. Their job's not to tidy after you. Although your mum might do that, your uncle might do that, and your auntie might do that, we're not doing that for you, because if you leave your litter all over your desk in work, you will get fired or have no one talking to you. So we have to implicitly, as Jay's already alluded to, teach that, but we have to give them reasons, don't we? We've said that before. You have to give people reasons. So what's the reason why you put your litter in the bin? I'll tell you.
No, I agree. I agree totally with that one. And that's that behaviour as a taught curriculum. As a taught curriculum, you're not telling them just to behave by sitting behind a desk for 5 hours a day. sitting in silence, nodding, following someone who's walking around the room for all like the old slant type of thing. It's not about that. It's about understanding why we do things at a certain time. Why it's not okay to just get up in the middle of a lesson and just start walking around and then going, well, it's my human right to get up and walk around for 10 minutes. Yeah, but you're disrupting the learning of 32 other pupils in this hot and sweaty classroom. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of things about careers now, and the Gatsby 8 benchmarks and everything was all about in year 10 and year 11, 12, 13. We need to do a lot of careers where to get them ready for the next steps and everything. I think that's, well, it has. It's come right all the way down to year 7 now. But even before that, it's the idea of that aspiration and inspiration. If we sat down with our pupils, and I often will do this, and we talk about where we lived, and it's not that we're very fortunate with our families now, and we live good lives and everything, but it wasn't always the case. And it's that idea of having that aspiration, but almost like a realistic aspiration. We're not asking them to go and try and pretend that they're going to be something that they're not, because that's not the case. But what you want to do? We all want to be footballers. I still might get the call up for playing right back on Saturday. I don't know, but it's that idea of you are able to go out and to do what we can give you the tools for, live your dream and everything else. But sometimes when you were talking, and just to go back a little bit on that mismatch, what we're telling them in school is not always backed up at home.
I think something we spoke about before we recorded the podcast was students and pupils saying, I'm not academic, when they're not less capable. They're just struggling maybe at one thing in school or in education in one moment. But what's actually happening to the child's identity when that phrase comes out and how they see themselves?
I mean, when somebody says I'm not academic, like when they say more, I tell you what, children say more, I can't do maths. Right? But if they said, I'm not academic, that's basically them forming an identity. You just said it before, Stu. So, that identity is an anathema to ambition and aspiration, as Jay's just alluded to. I think where it becomes a problem with belonging is when a student, for example, if we take maths and says, I struggled with that lesson. That's like, are we familiar with Carol Dweck's work on mindsets, fixed and otherwise? Yeah. She would argue that when we talk about mindsets, it's okay to say, I struggled with that maths lesson, because that would be sort of, not fixed. The problem becomes is when students start to say, I'm the kind of person who struggles, because that's when the identity forms. When that identity forms around pupils, that's really hard to undo that. And I think if we link that back to a belonging point of view, if children say, oh, school's not for me, to undo that, that's really difficult. So earlier on in the school career, that idea of belonging, and at every key stage, we have a responsibility. But if children come to us at key stage 3, we have a real responsibility to tackle that identity formation whereby this school's not for me. You never say it, but some kids feel it. You can see it. And that'll end up by year 8, by year 9, by year 10 being, say, for severe absence, should I say, or, complex antisocial behaviour, presenting in school. So we have a real duty to tackle. I mean, sometimes it's a throwaway line, oh, I'm not academic. Boom, that's bad. That's bad.
But then you've also got, you're just talking about severely absent pupils and things. You've also got absent pupils then, haven't you, as well, who fall into that category then of school's not for me, I'm not academic, and I'm really anxious about going to school now. So if I'm anxious about going to school, then I won't go in, and my mum will keep me off.
Yeah, I mean, I was at a DFE conference last week, just saying, Jay, in Leeds. It was really, really interesting. Some of the stuff that that now, Jay, some of the stuff that's coming out of the DFE at the moment, attendance data-wise, is amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they say, whoever, I can't remember his name now, on his keynote speech, was talking about how disadvantaged families have stopped listening to the DFE and the government. but they still hold the word of the head teacher as really, really important. And I found that quite surprising but actually, if you think about it from a working class family, you're used to the man telling you what to do. When I say the word man, I mean the people in authority. So the head teacher on the gate, the head teacher picking up the phone and making the calls. Myself and Jay know full well that the roles of head teachers are so difficult now. I mean, the business managers, the HR leaders, I feel for them. I mean, head teachers, mate, no tar. But also what's really important and what can't go missing in that is the head teacher who stands on the gate, the head teacher who picks up the phone and has that conversation, which makes mine and Jay's jobs easier because they listen to the man. We all listen to the man. And when I say man, I don't mean, I'm not trying to be all right on, but yeah, it's really important that.
It's funny you should mention trust in the head teacher because it loops back to something I've been sitting with for a while. We usually assume kids have to perform first and belonging is, well, a reward for that. What if we flipped it, belonging first and then performance follows? Does that actually hold up in a real classroom environment?
Yeah, so so some people will say that where you said you flipped it, so performing or belonging, which comes first. In traditional, you had to perform to belong, and that is it Eastwood, Stu, that Kiwi who does, in Eastwood, yeah. I mean, that book's amazing. Anyone who's listening to this, apologies, but also that's a book to read. That book is amazing. When we talk about this belonging before in schools, some people will challenge it and say, well, you're letting your expectations slip, aren't you? We have high expectations for these children. To do it the other way around can sometimes seem like a weakness, but to do it the way you suggested, belonging before, sort of is all about relationship building. And, at the core of everything we do, whether it's read Owen Eastwood's book or run a canteen in year 7, it's the belonging that matters. I mean, I know Jay would agree with that as well.
Just when we're talking about belonging to perform or perform to belong, we've also got to think about the transition between Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3, and maybe even because we haven't got a sixth form in our school. So when our year 11s go out to college or sixth forms or whichever pathway they're going to take, sometimes a student or a pupil will come on their own as well. And they might have come from, or even if they've come as a small group, they might have come from a place where they felt like they belonged. And I think sometimes we almost give some of our Key Stage 3 pupils a lack of respect when they come into a high school setting in year 7, because we treat them like the little ones again, and we treat them like they've got to almost earn that right to belong in the new establishment. Whereas they could be coming in with absolutely wonderful skills that we're not giving them credit for as well. It's one of those where you're stuck between a rock and a hard place sometimes, I think, because you do want them to perform. And if they perform well, we've got our awards evening tonight, and a load of our pupils for performance will get their rewards. But what about the ones who are just below that level? How are we making them feel? What are we doing for them?
When you talk about widening access and inclusion, but what does that look like in school?
So, I mean, what we're actually talking about, Stu, when we talk about belonging, if we go back to the very start, we're talking about widening access, aren't we? And writ large through the Ofsted framework is this concept of inclusion. Every school this August will be publishing their GCSE headline figures. And when we talk about widening access, say a school gets 4s and 5s, 60%, 70%. That's 30 children. 30% of the children didn't. And that's potentially the opportunity, but also the cost of that widened access. And it's great. But I mean, it's that idea that there'll always be winners and losers, but it's actually the actual losing the school game can have, and going back to Macbeth, can have tragic consequences for young people. So, when we talk about supporting that belonging, what we're not saying is we're lowering standards. What we're talking about is widening access. Your question was, what does that look like? So to widen access in schools, Jamie's mentioned attendance. I could talk about suspension. If we look across the UK and we look at suspension figures, Stu, you live in New Zealand. Who do you think gets suspended the most in British schools?
I'd say boys 15 to 16 years old that maybe need some sort of support.
Normally boys over girls, that's true. It's also boys from disadvantaged backgrounds, but also boys with a SEN. So let's just have a think about that. So realistically, what we're saying is that the British education system that costs an absolute fortune knows who these children are from when they're little. They're least likely to achieve, more likely to get suspended, more likely to end up being permexed, more likely to be in prison. We know that when they're 10. That sound like value to you, Stu?
Now, unfortunately, this has been going on under the guise of white working class boys for maybe 15 years. That coupled with the year 8 academic dip theory as well leads us to believe, and it's interesting to listen to you, Stu, when you say lads who are 15, 16, we're actually getting more suspensions now in primary school settings, and they're coming through, and that transition work now as they join us in high school. We're getting that key bits of information now. Oh, Jamie will be throwing chairs through the windows, and he'll be uncontrollable and everything else. And sometimes, as Duncan said, there are always, unfortunately, going to be winners and losers in the game, as we keep on referring it to, because that's the nature of a game. Not everyone can be winners, but it's that process, or the processes even, that we can try and put into place to say, do you know what, right? This is what we're doing to target these pupils who we've been highlighted, because there are suspensions now in year 7, year 8, and they're becoming more prominent. So, as Dunk said, value for money wise, it is what it is. It's not, as the case may be.
So if targeting specific pupils isn't the full answer, why does treating inclusion as a core practice baked into everything actually beat running, I'd say, like one-off targeted interventions?
The best schools that I've seen, we know for a fact, you don't do inclusion, right? That's just like nuts. When you do inclusion, what you actually do is you design everything inclusively. So there isn't like, in schools, you'll have a person who's in charge of inclusion, right? But actually that's good. And that works because they pull it all together. But inclusion is everything from meetings, the first impression on the gate, behaviour systems, curriculum, the way it's taught, the quality of the teaching, the communication with parents. Jamie's mentioned transitions. All of those things are what makes the difference. And anyone who says how we do inclusion, man, that sounds crazy, like, because you can't do inclusion.
But sorry to butt in though, but that comes through the culture, doesn't it? That comes through Duncan was talking before about the high expectations of everything. Ours is called the STM way, the St. Thomas More way. And it's ingrained through Catholic social teaching, and it's that daily diet, it's the lived experience of all the pupils. So staff will refer to them, pupils will refer to them. And you spoke about first impressions, and as people come into your establishment and they take a wander round, they get that feeling for it. And it's in those interactions. So I think as a senior leader, if you're getting that right, then that's the cornerstone of what everyone understands the expectations are of them. And then it's through the power of routine, the power of, I don't know, it's those meet and greets, isn't it? And it's done then through your CPD programs or whatever. But it certainly is for us anyway.
If a school wanted to start rebuilding belonging tomorrow, where should they actually begin? What's the number one practical first step they should take?
This is going to sound very woolly, what I'm going to say here now, but, begin by listening, listen to people. One of the biggest problems in schools is that the assumptions, we said that before, what are we assuming? And then tackle what we're assuming. The only way you're going to find out what you're assuming, really, when you talk about micro moments, is begin with listening to people. You said to me, I don't know what it's like to be 11 and disadvantaged in our school. So if you're saying to me, what could we actually do? Well, I'll tell you what, follow a student around for the day, right? Who is 11, who is disadvantaged in your setting, and then make notes, not based on what the quality of the teaching was like, but make notes maybe on those micro moments, and where would they have struggled to understand the rules of the game at that point? you could make a list, and then you could tackle those micro moments. But I think until you listen, until you observe, you're not going to know. Because
But I think, Dunk, I think just jumping in on that, I think when you were talking about Ofsted before and what they're looking for, and you walking around with an inspector and being able to tell them what they're looking at, what they're going to see, it's that idea of case studies, isn't it? And that's what all schools should be doing now. So when you're saying it sounds a bit woolly, you're absolutely right, Dunk. But it's that idea, isn't it, of being able to go round and have the story of those pupils, of that 11-year-old PP, DP pupil who, right, what can we say about Jamie? What do we know about him? Not what's his story, what do you want to be when he's older, and what's his favourite footy team, but what makes him tick? Why does he not come in on a Monday morning? Why does he struggle after coming in after holidays?
yeah, because ultimately Jamie's got to sit the same exams as everyone else, hasn't he?
Exactly.
He's got to know.
Exactly.
I'd say, right, for me, schools need to acknowledge that schools are set up and designed for pupils who already understand school. So the minority is the bit that we need to tackle for me.
I'd agree because the point where Duncan was saying before about that idea of what we assume, our assumptions are that everyone can read to their natural age. Everyone can access the same type of vocabulary because they've been read to as a baby, and they've been listening to classical music since they were in the womb, and that's it. And we can't carry on as a leader. We can't assume that every single pupil or student who walks through our doors have that lived experience. I'm not too sure about classical music in the womb, but it's definitely the idea. It's definitely the idea that we've got to have a wider understanding of who's coming, because we've been talking about inclusion, and Dunk's 100% correct when he turned around and he said, we can't, inclusion is not something we do to people. It's something that we do with them. That idea of care, if we put someone in care, we wouldn't provide care to them, we provide care with them.
We do quite a lot of work around. We have a teaching coaching program internal that we're all involved in as teaching staff. One of our theories of action, i.e. the things that we need to do better, theories of action, is this idea of relationship. And we spend a lot of time training, not staff, but training each other about the importance of relationships and what that looks like in the classroom and what it looks like on the corridor. And, and I think realistically what the theories of action are about is, in England, we talk a lot about what's good for children, which SEND is good for everybody. So it's about all of those quality first teaching techniques, such as, cold call and intentional pathways, scaffolding. What I would say is the whole theory of action coaching program is trying to make sure that somebody's difference, whether it be SEN or otherwise, doesn't become a deficit for that pupil. And that is ultimately the importance of belonging, isn't it? This idea that people who are different or have different starting points, that can't be a deficit.
Just touching on what Dunk's just said there, it's that idea of how do we ensure that we train our staff and everything else. Here we have also an internal program. We do quads where we get a group of 4 members of staff, and whether they be from different departments or SLT or whatever, and we talk about not only what we see in our own practice, but what we see in other practices as well. And one of the things that came out was professional language. So it's that language, as Dunk said there, of on the corridor. How do we speak to people on the corridor, whether it be peers, whether it be pupils or students, and what impact does that have? And I think when we're talking about even training and CPDF and things like that, it's the idea of what are we trying to train for? Is it just lip service? Is it just this idea that we're just holding a Wednesday staff training after school and we're going to do this? And you will have staff who just want to sit there and go, oh, do you know what, right? I've been teaching for 25 years. I know everything. But they're some of the worst teachers in the school because of the way they engage with the pupils or the students. I think it's that continued training of what are we providing for, going back again from this morning about this aspiration, inspiration. What are we trying to inspire our students and pupils to be and do? Are we are we active role models? And I think that's a big one for us. When we're talking about the fact that this is my background, this is where I was from, these are the schools I went to, this is the university I went to, which was just outside of Oxford and Cambridge, Luton University, and it was just a place of learning and enjoyment, and that's it. It's that feeling of, listen, you can be what you want to be, but let's role model it for pupils. We're not all from middle class families. We're not all from the leafy suburbs of Tarpley and Cheshire. Some of us have to drag ourselves up, pretty much like Dunk, to be honest.
Feral.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to use that word, but yeah, exactly.
So once you put all these belonging initiatives and programs in place, how do you know they're being effective, and how do you know they're working and successful? Are there any metrics that come along with the sense of belonging within education?
Well, school is, as Jamie and you both know, is full of metrics, isn't it? So lots of metrics that tell you the story. So for me, the two biggest metrics for belonging at school is behaviour data and attendance data. So if you like school, you'll go. If you belong, you'll go. If you're in school and you're being successful, you're not getting detentions. When I talk about behaviour data, Jay, I'm not just talking about suspensions and PXs, because they're obviously often for serious one-off instances that are beyond the pale when it comes to the mad things young people do. But I'm talking about that overtime build-up data of, how many detentions, how many, internal exclusions potentially. Those metrics for me. Now, it's not death by metrics, though, because you've got to measure, haven't you? You can do a lot of qualitative research within your setting. But if kids want to come to your school, your attendance data will be good. Then another podcast, define good, Stu.
No. It is. I agree with Dunk, but I also think as well about that sense of belonging as well. It is behaviour, it is attendance, and they are the cornerstone. I totally agree with Dunk that if our students or our pupils want to come to school, they will come to school, they'll behave, they'll learn, they'll thrive, they'll achieve. But it's also the extra bits as well on top for me, such as the personal development. And it's that thing of a sense of belonging sometimes is finding your niche within that school. So for our school, we have pupils who are in the performance department, which includes PE and drama. We have creative arts, and they'll go on to do textiles or something. But we have a lot of our pupils, because it's a Catholic school, who's in the Faith in Action group. And it's finding your niche, it's finding your area to then go, right, this is where I belong. Well, suppose that's it, isn't it? It's that, and I think Dunk mentioned this in the first few minutes. It's the idea of, I belong here and I'm happy here.
I think to go back to an earlier point, I think Dunk made around the book Belonging with Owen Eastwood, and finding your tribe, connection and community. And I think that's something that comes through in education and any industry where you're trying to find your path and your way, and you want to be part of something bigger than yourself. You're just finding your community, really, in your tribe.
Yep, 100%. And you said it before, Stu. That's exactly what you said before. And it's this idea, isn't it? And we might come in with a preconceived idea of what my tribe is and what your tribe is. But then you find your way, you find your path to being happy in school. And that's something which I think everyone strives for, to find that little bit of happiness within your school setting, which not everyone can get.
Is that something you'd agree with, Dunk?
Yeah, I certainly would. And, Jamie's right. There is the soft data around the idea of belonging to your school. I suppose when we talk about your question also, it alluded to, whose responsibility is it? That's simple. That's every adult in the school, isn't it? Senior leadership, of course, but it's every adult, because those children have relationships with so many people, and those relationships shape the belonging. So that would be the only thing I would add to what Jay said.
It's a little bit what Dunk said before about this idea of, there are going to be some casualties, there are going to be some failures, and what does our culture do for that? What do we do at the end of year 11? So, or not as the case may be, what happens when a pupil or a student gets suspended or pexed from your school? What have you done leading up to that? what's been in your culture leading up to that, as opposed to leading up to the other 700 kids in the school? Does that culture fit in for absolutely everyone? Because I think we're quite lucky in our school settings that we are oversubscribed. People want to come to our places of learning. And I just don't think, as a senior leader, sometimes I think our culture looks for an overriding success of 100%, and it's not realistic.
This has all been brilliant, and it's obviously coming from deep inside education. But a good chunk of people listening to this aren't in schools or education. They're in business and sport and running teams of their own. Does everything we've talked about today land the same way outside the school gate?
From me, I would say, me and Jay are in education, but I know, Stu, you have clients from all different walks of life. I would say, from a generic point of view, I'd say belonging isn't a wellbeing initiative. It's not something that people are going to be talking about till the next thing comes out. For me, it's about organisational design. So you design belonging. It's not something that's just, character or even an individual skill set. It's got to be designed. That would be my...
What's the one thing that we're missing or we've missed in culture, or an idea you've been thinking about for a while, or a light bulb moment? What's that one thing that we're missing?
Yeah, we've spoken at length about this, haven't we? For me, this idea of culture, I know we're trying to wrap it up here, but if I could get people who are listening to this to do one thing, it would be read the Owen Eastwood book. It was, I don't know whether you've read it, Jay. It is,
No.
Honestly, from a sporting perspective, from an organisational perspective, it is absolutely phenomenal. And it's particularly important for someone like Stu, who lives in New Zealand, because he's a Kiwi, and he talks about the importance of heritage and family and all those golden threads that run through us all. It's just exceptional.
Yeah, it's a good point you make, Dunk, about the book Belonging, Owen Eastwood. Belonging and the Ancient Code of Togetherness, I think it's called. And Eastwood talks about a Maori concept about whakapapa, which is essentially about, like you said, about your heritage and your lineage and the people that have gone before you, and connection and identity is a big one, and all that togetherness type stuff. So it's a really good read, like you said. And if people want to grab a copy of that, if they also head to the Culture Room website and click Culture 360, we've done a review on that as well, on all the good work Owen Eastwood's done in that space. So yeah, you're right in what you say. It's a really good read, and also something that you touched on before around habitus, and you talked about whose responsibility is it, and the home environment overlapping or marrying in with the school environment. And I think that's quite important to address that, because again, sort of in that Māori lens, you have whānau or whānau, which is the extended family. And I guess in Māori culture and Pacifica culture as well, it's very much about the wider family and the community and that connection. And the concept that you talked about, habitus, before, was about taking responsibility for some of the development of the student or the pupil, not just the onus being on the school.
Problem with belonging is it feels a little bit like snake oil. So when you speak to colleagues, everyone knows that they need to develop it, because all of the metrics in school are impacted going one way by the amount of belonging equates the amount of success you get for young people. I think the reason why we're doing this today, and the conversations that we've had running up to this, is all about, let's try and remove the snake oilness away from it. Let's try and toolkit it out. Let's try and think about, what does that look like? Because I think schools and school leaders understand the need for belonging, but then when it comes to unpacking it and what does it actually look like, they'll be surprised about how much they're already doing. I think it's trying to remove the myth and remove the snake oil and give practical paths.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in terms of the snake oilness of around culture. It's the first thing people or organisations should think about doing and setting in place or evolving the culture that they have. But generally, it's the last thing that they want to fund because it can be intangible. But again, I think that goes back to some of the points you made earlier about metrics and schools being about metrics. Once we start to see the dial move, whatever that might look like, people then start to really sit up and notice how much culture, organisational culture, affects teams and workplaces and organisations. And obviously, we're trying to crack the space around belonging here. Once people feel more connected and part of the tribe, then you do start to see the results come through.
When some of the most successful sports teams, some of the most successful organisations have been doing it for years, but they just haven't called it belonging. And whether we look at, whether we're talking about the All Blacks, whether we're talking about England at the moment. I mean, I'm a Scotland fan, as you know, so God, I don't want to be talking about that lot. But apparently the New England manager has really developed a sense of belonging, and then people buy into it, don't they? And then they're in the quarters, and they're going to get beat by Norway, of course, but it's not the first time the English have been beaten by the Vikings, mate. Harold Harder.
You're not going to start talking about Bannockburn, are you, and singing Flower of Scotland?
Oh, well, don't get me onto that, because that was... Anyway, I can't talk about that. I'm still upset, and it was 500 years ago. But, I think, this idea, isn't it? There was that book about legacy, the All Blacks. I can't use the word that he uses because it's got a minor swear word in it. But I think you put it better when we were speaking the other week, which was about this idea that if you have more than one ego that's too big for the team, you've got to click, and clicks kill culture. Now, I don't personally know any of those England players, or could even say why they weren't selected. But I tell you what, I can tell you, it does seem that he hasn't got clicks in that team. And that team is it goes back to ancient philosophy, doesn't it? Socrates and the sum of the parts. It's not about the individuals, it's the collective identity. And lo and behold, we're back to belonging.
Well, I think we could probably squeeze out a whole other podcast on Tuchel in England. Jamie, this has been an awesome episode. It's been brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for your time and your energy and your knowledge and your insights. It's been amazing. For the listener, this is part 1 of the education series for Culture 360. There will be parts 2 and 3 coming shortly, so please stay tuned for those. There will be a whole host of other episodes as well coming your way, so please keep your eyes on the socials and the website and the YouTube channel for those. Until then, I'm your host, Stu Savage. This has been Culture 360, culture from every angle. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the Culture 360 podcast, and like me, you geek out on leadership and organisational culture, then please smash a like, subscribe, and share the podcast. Also, if you have any feedback or ideas, or you'd like to get in touch, then please connect with the Culture Room at thecultureroom.co.nz or on our various social media platforms. Thanks for listening.